Alright, so back with another video. I was trying to look which one to choose. People have sent me different ones. And what caught my eye is a story of Indianization. Why I picked this? Because I traveled around in Southeast Asia also, and I saw Indian, signs everywhere. Indian kings, like this one is about Cambodia. The title of the video, How an Indian Merchant Became Cambodia's First King. So I was in Cambodia. I saw Angkor Wat, which is, I think, or Angkor Thom, the whole, city, considered one of the world wonders, I think. It's crazy. You have to see it to understand what I'm talking about. Anyway, but Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, everywhere I went, there's obviously Indian kings. They built their structures, temples, and so this one is about Cambodia. Let's check it out.
India and Southeast Asia have a rich, overlapping history. In art, architecture, language,
this
and
is
religion,
Angkor Wat,
India and Southeast Asia share striking similarities. But how and when did Southeast Asia become so Indianized?
15th century?
The answer is hidden in an
16th?
ancient Cambodian love story. Cambodia's origins are anything but ordinary. The love between a native princess and an Indian
much
merchant
earlier.
served as its foundation. Yup, Cambodia's first king was an Indian merchant, a man known as Kaundinya.
From Tamil, maybe.
Kaundinya's story begins in the 1st century CE. His historical name, Kaundinya, provides the first insight into his life because it's not his true given name. Kaundinya is a reference to a Brahmin community that populates the Andhra Orissa coast, a region commonly known as Kalinga. Kalinga was a powerhouse of early Indian trade, and their merchant mariners were called Sadhava. Kaundinya himself was a Brahmin Sadhava, and it's likely that he was wealthy and well-connected. He was the owner of one or more large merchant vessels, or boidas, the expertly crafted, square-sailed ships of Kalinga. There was at least one major manufacturing center for boidas at Golabai, on Lake Chilika. Lake Chilika also served as a port of departure for merchants. As a large body of water with a narrow opening to the sea, it offered a natural, protected harbor. But before we turn our focus back to Kaundinya, let's take a look at the bigger picture. In this era, foreign trade was so extensive that port cities like Nagapatnam had bazaars crowded with crates of imported goods. This trade is associated with a long period of rising prosperity in both South and Southeast Asia. But trade wasn't limited to the east. In the west, Rome had just conquered Egypt, and thanks to the revitalization of old Egyptian maritime routes, Romans and Indians began trading extensively. Roman senators were hyper-concerned about hyper-deflation, as so much of their silver was being depleted by being sent to India through trade. So with all that in mind, let's get back to Kaundinya. Kaundinya set sail for Southeast Asia in the 1st century CE. But how did he actually get there? In that era, Indian mariners would wait for seasonal monsoon winds coming from the northeast. Using these winds, they quickly sailed down the coast, all the way to Sri Lanka. Along the way, mariners would conduct trade at urban centers on the coast. Then, from the northern tip of Sri Lanka, Indian mariners would cut a straight path to Southeast Asia, across the Bay of Bengal.
They're wild.
Severe weather and rampant piracy made this crossing extremely dangerous.
I was thinking that's not the steady ocean there.
The Andaman Sea. From here, Indian mariners could continue into the Straits of Malacca, hug the southern coast of Sumatra all the way to Java, make a brief land crossing at the Isthmus of Kra. We don't know which specific route Kaundinya took, but we do know that he eventually found himself in the Gulf of Thailand, ready to do business.
That guy is wild.
Kaundinya could have been carrying a variety of high-demand Indian goods, cotton textiles, jewelry, and metalware. In addition, he could have been carrying Western goods. All of this valuable cargo put a target on Kaundinya's back. Pirates would almost certainly be lurking on the fringes. And wouldn't you know it, they were. Kaundinya's ship was surprise attacked by local pirates.
Yeah, I bet that's how it looked like.
And successfully repulsed the pirates.
Skull picture,
the
yeah.
ship was damaged during the
Be gone, pirates.
Kaundinya was forced to beach the ship for repairs. While beached, Kaundinya and his crew must have feared a second attack.
Kaundinya is a wild guy.
For the pirates had been employed by a local chieftain, whose daughter, Soma,
they wanted him
had fallen
dead.
in love with the handsome young merchant. It was Kaundinya's bravery during the attack that won her affections. Soma sent over a marriage proposal. Kaundinya must have been surprised, or perhaps he feared for his life should he reject it. In the end, he accepted the proposal. This is considered a landmark event in Cambodian history, the establishment of its first true kingdom,
Hormonal
with an Indian merchant
takeover.
sitting on its throne. But Kaundinya and Soma's marriage was not the last of its kind. It would serve as a blueprint for many Indian Southeast Asian political marriages to come. We're interested in the capital T truth. So why did Soma actually marry Kaundinya?
So India is big on trade, they wanna make
In
connections.
the late classical era, Southeast Asia was characterized by fragile, politically fractured states. But change was on the horizon. With rising trade came an influx of wealth, and new agricultural developments led to a population boom.
They wanted
State
money.
reforms were seen as necessary to address these new challenges. And that's where Indianization comes in. Indian political and cultural traditions had already solved these societal challenges. India was already densely populated, wealthy, and urbanized. For hundreds of years, in fact. Simply put, Indianization was a solution to the problems that Southeast Asia now faced. And who better to implement Indianization than Indians themselves? Educated Indians were imported in droves. For example, Brahmin clerks were brought from India to serve in Southeast Asian administrations. And most of these Indian immigrants married local women, often noble women. Access to nobility gave Indian immigrants institutional legitimacy. In other words, they were given power and the means to wield it. Chinese historical records are illuminating in this regard. These records make reference to several Indian immigrants who became royals in Cambodia. Reports include one king of Funan, Chandana, yes, another immigrant from India, who sent a gift of elephants to Jin Dynasty China. Another one of these reports include an Indian Brahmin.
At that time, when
whose
you're
name also translates to
Indian, you
Kaundinya.
just go
This
traveling,
Kaundinya
look
II
for
supposedly heard a voice
pretty-
telling him that
pretty
he was
princesses.
a rightful ruler of Funan, and so he journeyed to the east. When he arrived
God,
in
how
Funan, reports
times have
indicate that
changed.
he was welcomed warmly and was selected as their new king, presumably by marrying a local princess. The
Imagine
Chinese
back
report
then,
even
you,
points out,
if you were from
Kaundinya
India,
changed
you were
all
a
the
man of
laws that formed
status.
the system of India. Active yet peaceful social transformation is rare, and it's even more rare for foreigners to lead the transformation. That's why the Indianization of Southeast Asia is such a surprising historical moment. To summarize, foreign immigrants were brought in to fill the ranks of elite society. These new immigrants were actually encouraged to shape the local culture so that it more closely resembled their own. And all of this
Wow.
happened without threats, violence, or other pressure.
That's interesting.
But Indianization wasn't a one-time
Happened
event.
on its own.
It was a continuous process occurring over a 1,000-year period. The story of Kaundinya and Soma is just one of many in this larger saga. So returning to our original question, why did Soma choose Kaundinya? The answer should be obvious now. Kaundinya was exactly what she needed to succeed in an increasingly Indianized world. As a Southeast Asian noblewoman,
It wasn't
Soma
hormones
offered
after all.
institutional
It
legitimacy.
was
Kaundinya, on the other hand,
calculated
was a wealthy
decision.
and well-connected merchant with extensive political and commercial networks in India. Kaundinya's Indianness was an advantage with real-world, measurable consequences. It's worth noting, Soma's family was not that powerful. They controlled only a small sub-region
So they
of Khmer territory,
linked up
but Kaundinya's arrival changed their fortunes.
for power.
Together, Kaundinya and Soma expanded this humble state into a large and prosperous kingdom. Perhaps this rapid expansion was made possible by Kaundinya's Indianness. He had the tools to fast-track the process of Indianization, after all. Between the 4th and 8th centuries CE, several prosperous empires emerged in India and Southeast Asia. Each of these entities were heavily engaged in the Indianization process, the Guptas and the Pallavas exporting their culture, and Srivijaya importing it. But this wasn't entirely a one-way exchange. Southeast Asia had at least some impact on the subcontinent too. Consider the Pallava dynasty. The Pallavas were a wealthy and powerful trading empire whose origins have been the subject of a spirited debate. Early historians suggested Persian roots, while later historians suggested Tamil or Telugu roots. These historians had an incomplete view, however. Recent scholarship has revealed a hybrid South Indian and Southeast Asian origin. See, the Pallava dynasty began with the South Indian king's marriage to a queen who was referred to as a Naga.
Naga.
The Naga queen may have actually been Southeast Asian.
A snake?
Consider the term Naga itself.
Snake.
The term Naga, which denotes a race of mythical snake humans, has long been associated with the people of Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, for example,
lots of
Khmer
snakes
royalty
there,
made Naga
snake
iconography
symbolism.
essential to their identity, and Naga carvings litter their temples and palaces. Perhaps this connection shouldn't be too surprising, given what we know about the Pallava dynasty. The Pallavas had a long history of inserting themselves into international affairs in the rest of Asia. For example, in the early 700s, they entered into a mutual defense pact with Tang Dynasty China. But let's explore another story from the dynasty's past. In 731 CE, the Pallavas were on the brink of collapse. Their king, Parameshvara, suddenly died in battle, leaving no direct heir. There was a danger that rival kingdoms would encroach on their territory. The Pallavas had to find the proper king to take the throne, and they had to do it quickly. A formal delegation was created to find Hiranya, the descendant of an ancient Pallava prince named Bhima. Bhima was an ancestor of the now deceased king.
Is Bhima the well-known one?
Hiranya and others would have a right to take the throne. But there was a catch. Hiranya was not to be found in India, for Bhima had traveled abroad, married a Southeast Asian princess, and had become the ruler of a foreign kingdom through that marriage. Now I'd say that's a familiar story, don't you think?
Yep.
So with all this in mind, the Pallava delegation boarded a ship to Southeast Asia to speak to Bhima's descendant, King Hiranyavarman. It's believed that he was the leader of the Champa kingdom, located in modern-day Vietnam. When they arrived at Hiranya's court, the delegation was warmly received. And soon enough, the delegation got down to business. They asked for one of Hiranya's sons to come back to India and take the Pallava throne. Hiranya's youngest son agreed to this mission. At just 12 years old, he made the journey to South India. He was given the regnal name Nandivarman II and ascended the Pallava throne. Rival claimants and power-hungry nobles felt this was a wrong decision. After all, Nandivarman II was a foreigner. To quell this concern,
13 years old, who's gonna listen to him?
Made efforts to highlight his true Pallava heritage.
Times have changed.
But here's some food for thought. What made his background true is that he was of mixed Indian and Southeast Asian ancestry, just like the original pairing that founded the Pallava dynasty. Nandivarman II would grow to become an extremely successful king. He was perhaps the greatest of the Pallavas, presiding over an empire at its apex, an economic and cultural golden age. And all this he accomplished as a foreigner. Nandivarman's foreign origins seem to have ensured his continued interest in Eastern affairs. For example, inscriptions written on his behalf have been found in northern Malaysia, in the kingdom of Kedah. Interestingly, this kingdom is located in the Bujang Valley, which roughly translates to Valley of the Serpents.
Yep.
And in Sanskrit, the term Bujang is a synonym of the term Naga. Very curious indeed. Nandivarman II is, like Kaundinya and other pioneers before him, a symbol of Indianization and the deep connection between India and Southeast Asia. Only today, after 6 centuries of Chinese, Arab, and European influence, has the contribution of India been neglected. And now you know.
Very interesting, I would say. Boy, how times have changed. First of all, India used to be, like you see here and from the other videos, used to be this powerhouse of trade and just culture and everything. Everybody, you see, they tried to marry those people, and and this is what I saw in there. Also traveling around, so many Indian routes. And also what's interesting, how how times have changed nowadays, how the trade used to happen very freely, and now there's all this kind of hassle going on with the trade, and people are figuring it out. But also it's the same issues then, same issues now, just on a right now it's much larger scale and much more well known because of the internet and so on. So very interesting stuff. Looking forward to seeing more of these videos, and until then, see you. Bye.